From Supermodel in her teens, Lily went on to act in films and TV, is an environmental campaigner and now a social entrepreneur, co-founder of a website called impossible.com, which, as the name suggests, has got huge ambitions. It seems to make the impossible possible. If you go to the website front page, it says, "We are a group of people who have come together to help solve meaningful problems and guide global change. Cancer diagnosis, fake news, bots in the workplace, creative self, opaque supply chains, fair insurance, emotional connectivity," and it goes on. You've obviously got huge ambition, Lily, to change the world.
Well, I mean, the piece of text you just read is a collective, right? I'm not personally working on all those different things, but I don't know. I guess we have a limited amount of energy, right? And we have to choose where to direct it. And for me personally, it's always been either things that I find creatively inspiring or that trying to solve problems or have an impact. And tech is a powerful way to try and do that. And so, hence the landing page you just described.
And it's called Impossible because you want to make the impossible possible.
It's called Impossible. Yeah, I guess I had a very specific idea at the beginning of setting up the company, which was to use technology to connect people to share more, and specifically sharing without money. And that felt like kind of like the impossibly utopian idea. I'd just written a thesis in university called Impossible Utopias, and I was like, "Oh, impossible! That'd be a cool name for it." And amazingly, it was possible to get it. So that's where the company originated, and now we've diversified and are doing lots of different things.
Where does this come from? This desire to change the world? I mean, were you always like this?
I'm like afraid of that phrase when I hear that. Actually, it's interesting.
Which phrase? Where did it come from?
To
change
the world. Yeah. I did a movie with Terry Gilliam many years ago, and I remember him having a line in that script which was like, "Don't try and change the world. The world's fine just by itself." But I guess I have had always a kind of that spirit of looking at social problems or environmental problems. I think was very much probably sown by my mum. My mum's kind of very vocal, opinionated, in a kind of intelligent and quiet way, but in a kind of prolific way, and I grew up with that around, and then also just the reality is we do have so many problems, and if you're privileged enough to be living in a society and a space where you can think about those problems, it feels to me important and necessary to do so.
Tell me a bit more about your mum. What do you mean? I mean, how did this manifest itself? Was it
well,
the way she brought you up, the chat around the table, or what?
I just mean it's like you always at some point go, right, I'm just turning into my mum or I'm just turning into my dad, and my mum's a very conscientious person, so and I grew up, she was a single mother, so I grew up, she was the main influence probably in my life growing up, and so it's hard to know, maybe I would be exactly the same if I'd been adopted and brought up by a different family, but I doubt it because I feel like her politics has influenced my own. When I say politics, she's not actually that political, but it's like a politics of caring. Like she's a very compassionate person who's very, very sensitive. She's always been quite ill herself, and I think that in a way maybe the fact that she's been physically ill has made her acutely sensitive to the pains of other people. So she's an incredibly compassionate person.
I kind of want to hear more about that in a way. When you say the politics of caring, I mean, what do you think that is? Is that just caring about people?
I just think some people are more empathetic, sympathetic than others, and it may be a coincidence, but I've often thought it's maybe because she's physically ill that makes her so like intensely sensitive to the suffering of others, and that's just part of her personality. And so I couldn't tell you specific ways that affected me, but I feel like we are affected by our parents enormously, and so that presence growing up made me think about maybe more than myself.
And so when you were a young child, your mum was ill then as well, was she? I mean, you were aware of this.
Yeah. But I'm not. That's not the picture I'm painting. I'm just saying more. I think that's how I've kind of analysed her own personality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were at school in London, weren't you? I mean, at good schools, posh schools.
Actually,
no?
That's interesting. That's your perception. I mean, I went to 90% state schools. I only went to a posh school, so to speak, at the very end. Yeah, when I was already modelling, and I was in a different situation when I was 16. But previous to that, I went to always state schools.
So, what was your school like when you were at secondary school from 11 onwards?
The best school, in my experience, I went to was a school called Horfield. Best in terms of the impact it had on me. and that's a kind of very nondescript state school in Bayswater, and I just happened to be really lucky and go in a year that we had amazing teachers, some of which I'm still friends with actually, and I became family friends, and also really amazing. Like my first best friends were in that group of people, and it was incredibly diverse as well. And I think that was something that I really cherish now. I have a 2.5-year-old, so I'm kind of starting to think about the process of where to send her to school, and it's a really challenging one because I look back on my own school history and I think, yeah, there was a benefit of going to like a kind of very academically well-achieving private school where I went for college when I was 16, and I see all those benefits, but it was also a predominantly white middle-class environment that I wouldn't have learnt the same things that I learnt from being in a very diverse state environment when I was younger.
Obviously, very quickly, you then went into modelling, and it's about as far away from this kind of change the world vibe that I can imagine. And so I'm trying to sort of picture you as a young child entering this new world of modelling.
Okay, well, I guess the two dovetail in a funny way, but I say my kind of social conscientiousness came early on in the sense that I made it. Yeah, I feel so conceited talking to myself. I'm trying to say this and not make it sound like I'm showing off about myself as a kid. I became vegetarian when I was 10, so that's a kind of active step I took in I guess, yeah.
Why?
And I was a really, I think, annoying vegetarian. Those kids who just have worked, it took me 10 years, I'm not a genius, it took me 10 years to figure out you have to kill animals in order to eat them. And I think at that point in time I was the only vegetarian in my family. There's now quite a few of us. And I then became that irritating kid who goes into school and tells everyone why they should be a vegetarian.
And it was just animal welfare, was it?
Yeah, it was
you
purely,
just didn't like killing animals to eat them.
It was 100% animal welfare. At that point in time, it was actually considered really unhealthy to be vegetarian, and nobody was aware of the environmental consequences. So typically, if you tell people you're a vegetarian, they would say, yeah, but are you getting enough protein, and how do you get your, Whereas now, interestingly, I'm still vegetarian, and now, interestingly, people often ask, oh, is that for health reasons or is that environmental reasons?
Yeah, people get it in a much more sophisticated way now.
Well, and also your reasoning is completely different now. Yeah.
So how old were you when modelling first reared its head in your life?
I was 14.
Right. And how did that come about?
I was walking around Soho quite late, actually, with a couple of friends from school, and there was a scout there called Benjamin who worked at the modelling agency that I signed with called Storm, and he just came over to me and presented me a card and asked me if I would want to come in. It
was a classic you were spotted on the street kind of story.
Yeah.
And what did you think of modelling when you were 14? I mean, did you think this was a good thing to do? Or an exciting
I think
thing
it was
to
exciting.
do?
Yeah. I think I didn't have any expectations, I had no idea what that would manifest as, if anything. Didn't know anything about the world, didn't know if I'd be successful, so there was no guarantees with what that meant.
Had you had a sort of a dream job when you were 14? Did you have any idea what you wanted to do?
I'd always wanted to act, actually, from quite a young age. I'd had a very short stint where I'd gone to a theatre school when I was younger. It's actually the only exception to my narrative about going to all these different state schools. I went to Sylvia Young for 6 months, and that, I think, had sown in me. I actually hated it as an experience, but I think
that why it was only 6 months? You left?
It was a weird mix. It was I was really unhappy there, and also they closed my year. I was really young, and I think it was the last year they had taken kids that young. I don't know how they are now, but I was around 6, I think, or 7. Anyway, that experience, I think, had planted a seed in me that then kind of carried on growing, and I went to the secondary school I mentioned. I went on a drama placement. It was a performing arts school, and I'd carried on kind of being interested in drama and wanted to work in that space. I hadn't thought about modelling. I think maybe a few people in the year before I was scouted had said to me, maybe you could model, but I was an insecure kid. I didn't see myself in that way, so it didn't necessarily resonate. And I think when the guy scouted me, I didn't really know what to expect of it, but of course it was exciting. I'd never travelled the world. I was having a certain type of life, and the idea of going off and having a different one felt, could be really exciting. So that was the initial, I think, probably the first few years and the reaction to it.
And did it seem like another world?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because I very quickly started traveling the world and, being in very kind of adult professional environments and very creative environments. And I feel very lucky that I got given that experience because it was very positive at that point in my life.
Do you feel, because you've sort of moved away from modelling now, haven't you? I mean,
that very quickly my social conscience caught up with that, and
Yeah.
I started to like question what I was advertising and question wearing fur and question wearing this and that and this and that, and then I actually found a way of dovetailing the two things together and looking a lot into supply chains and how do you source products and the impact that fashion has.
even while you were modelling back then?
Yeah. And initially that was a kind of conflict with what I was doing. And I remember at one point my very lovely agent, who I still work with, saying, "Aren't you scared you're biting the hand that feeds you?" is what she said. So initially it was like a kind of a tension, and I probably did lose some work over that, like having strong positions on certain things. But then actually it kind of went full circle, and I started to actually work with companies that had really good kind of ethics embedded. Like I worked at the Body Shop for a few years. So it, in a weird way, dovetailed round and has enabled me to find a new way of working with fashion. I mean, I do very little now, but...
I mean, people never told you off then. I mean, I suppose you'd already become so big that people couldn't dismiss you that easily.
Maybe they did behind my back, I don't know. They didn't to my face.
But you never had people sort of challenging you and saying, just get on with it and take the picture. You know, you're a model, not a...
Well, it wasn't that I was doing it
CEO.
on shoots, but the first thing I remember is just saying I wasn't going to wear fur, and that's not a particularly controversial thing. A lot of models have done that, but it is a specific. I remember specifically losing a job in Milan Fashion Week because you couldn't not wear fur, like everything was fur. And there were specific instances like that happened, but it wasn't a major amount. And I was moving away from modelling anyway. I think regardless of the kind of social questions, I knew I'd never wanted to do it as a full-time job.
Why?
I actually never did it as a full-time job because I was probably too geeky. I was in school. I was modelling the most 15, 16, 17, which is actually when I was still in school. So I was only ever kind of fitting it in part-time with schoolwork. I then decided to go to university. I very quickly kind of pushed the acting desire that I had, and kind of from the age of about 16 started looking at doing first a short film and then a feature-length film. So I was kind of I guess I had my thumbs in so many different pies that it was a natural thing to move away from anyway. And the relationship beyond the kind of creative friendships, which I still value from that industry, the main thing I kept from that experience, and I'm still working on now, is the kind of actually the impact of business and the impact of supply chains, which is massive. Fashion is a huge industry and has a huge global footprint socially and environmentally. And I started very early looking at kind of what's called sustainable fashion or ethical fashion. And it's really exciting to see now, 12, 14 years later, that that's such a kind of growth part of the industry and is becoming more and more, I wouldn't say it's mainstream yet, but it's definitely becoming slightly more mainstream.
Is ethical fashion an oxymoron?
It's a good question, yeah. Or sustainable fashion is definitely an oxymoron, right? Yes and no. I mean, yes, of course, there's a kind of inherent contradiction there, especially if you think of fashion as a kind of very like a trend-based cycle. At the same time, we have to wear clothes, right? We live in particularly in a climate like England, where you're not going to walk around naked, whatever your social political beliefs might be. We do have to dress ourselves, and there is nothing wrong, or I don't think there's anything to be apologetic about wanting to dress yourself in an interesting, creative, expressive way. Can we find ways to do that aren't detrimental to the planet, that aren't disrespecting people? Can we morph the industry, which has become increasingly disposable, back into something that is more positive?
Do you think you can do it from the outside, or does it have to be done from within?
That's, to be honest, a kind of ongoing question I've always had, and I don't think I'll ever find the answer to, and I don't think anyone has the answer to. I used to believe that if you want to change something, you have to do it from the inside. I used to always think if you want to repaint a room, you got to go into the room to repaint it, and that has been my approach.
So do you feel you've left the
working.
fashion industry now? I mean, do you feel part of it, or?
I feel like I'm on the edges. I still have friendships. I still am involved in some sustainable fashion initiatives, and that's the area of interest that I will keep, and I'm sure do more with in the future. But I don't don't really model anymore. I'm not involved in that level.
But did you sort of
I don't
walk
really
away
follow
from
trends.
it in disgust in any way? Or was it just that it wasn't ever really what you wanted to do?
It wasn't what I ever wanted to do full time forever. And it's not that I'm disgust. Like, I just try and, like, I had both positive and negative experiences and feelings about it as an industry. And so I just try and, like, cherry pick the positive ones and not dwell too much, you know, like, and I just wanted to do other things. So you only have 365 days in a year, right? So if you want to do university and act and write and set up tech businesses or like all the other different, you know, opportunities or interests that come my way, it's inevitable that other stuff will fall away, and it's something that kind of naturally fell away, if that makes sense.
But that's the thing that made you. That's the thing that made you who you are and gave you the profile and the wealth and all of those things that have enabled you to do what you're now doing.
So I feel very grateful to it. Yeah.
Is grateful the right word? I mean, why should you feel grateful for
grateful to life?
Yeah.
Not to a singular person.
And not certainly to that industry. I mean, were you aware of that, of all the things that we now, you know, are talking about within that industry, and what was wrong with it when you were in it?
Well,
when you were a
talking about?
16-year-old girl. Well, I mean, everything from its impact on body image and girls and all of those sorts of, you know, aspects to, you know, what we've now revealed in the Me Too movement and sexual harassment and all those sorts of things that were going on there as well. Did you know about all of that when you were at your peak?
Has there been much come out in the Me Too movement with regards to fashion?
A little bit, you know, from certain photographers.
Oh, yeah. I remember that. The question, was I aware of that? Yeah, I mean, how can you not be? It is a complex industry that has a lot of negative repercussions, and I think that was quite evident and obvious. And there's no one person, I don't think, that's to blame for that.
But was it something you were fending off, or was it something you were aware of, happens to other people, but didn't happen to you?
I think my main, from that perspective, my main issue with the industry, and I because I haven't really been involved with it the last few years, I was actually speaking to a model this week about it who's very successful at this moment in time, and so I was kind of gauging her feelings about the health of the industry right now from that perspective. Definitely when I was in it, the main issue I felt was, one, you were dealing with girls who are very young, so most models are in their teens, at a very vulnerable part of their lives, and it bred a lot of insecurity, which is ironic because in a way you think these are the most secure girls in the world because they're being told they're beautiful and being paid for how they look. But so often it felt to me like a meat market where, in the same way that fashion trends come and pass really quickly, you know, and so everyone will be in love with something for 10 minutes and then not the next. I always felt like that was also a bit the relationship to the models. There was a kind of disposability that maybe 50 years ago, or maybe not 30 years ago, it didn't seem to be that you had, you know, there was a kind of supermodel era where it didn't feel like there was that kind of churn of models. And maybe there wasn't that churn of clothes as well. I don't know the industry well enough then to compare it. But it felt to me a bit like the kind of disposable relationship we culturally established to clothes, which was maybe kind of healthy, we were also applying to people as well. That was the kind of biggest problem I identified.
Did you fear being thrown away?
You could constantly be thrown away because if you think about it from a contractual perspective, you're self-employed, right? And you're only as good as everyone considers you to be in that moment in time. And you're in a fickle industry where fashions are changing all the time. So
there wasn't a moment where you thought, well, I'm a supermodel now, you know, I'm untouchable.
No. I like how you opened your arms to demonstrate that pose as if you're on the Titanic front. No, I mean, and other models may have different experiences, so I can't speak for everyone in the industry, but it was a weird mix. I'd been bullied in school. I came into it as quite an insecure person. In some ways, it gave me a lot of security in myself, and in other ways, it made me incredibly insecure. And maybe that was also part of my movement away from it as an industry, because I never really wanted to depend on the kind of, you know, needing that approval.
Why were you bullied at school?
God, this is like turning into like a therapy session.
No, I'm just intrigued. It's sort of, you drop these things in, you go, oh yeah, I was bullied at school. You go, really? Why? It's like...
I think mainly because I had red hair, and that is a reason, unfortunately, that lots of kids are bullied in school that they shouldn't be. Maybe also because I was quite, I don't know, maybe I was a bit different, maybe I was a bit quiet, I don't know. You don't know, right? I don't know. Were you ever bullied in school?
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
were you bullied in school?
Race,
Yeah.
basically. Sort of
Yeah.
fairly simple thing.
And did you find that the teachers turn a blind eye to that, or did they?
Teachers didn't really know,
Okay.
I don't think.
Yeah.
And it was, and you didn't tell.
Okay.
And
was that-
actually, the guy who bullied me wrote me a letter. He became a teacher, and he wrote me a letter when we were at university, because I was on TV when I was at university. And he wrote me a letter of apology,
Oh wow.
sort of saying I realised how awful I was when we were young. It was it was when I was 13, 14 or something like that, and he wanted to say sorry.
Wow. Did you reply?
I didn't. I should have done, but I
here's
didn't.
your reply.
Here's my reply. But I didn't because I think I was still a bit angry.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought I
Where
didn't
was
want to
that?
let him off the hook.
Yeah.
To be honest, by just saying, "Don't worry, it's fine."
Yeah,
we'll
totally.
do that.
Yeah.
We're
all
'cause we
racist.
don't. It's like, so you live with it. You live with your guilt. It's my fault. So let's talk about this. Because what you're doing now, do you, are you a dreamer? Because you look at what you're doing now and you kind of think, do you have some sort of utopian view of the world that you're trying to achieve, that you think is actually achievable, that you can actually deliver change, or is it that you're just, you're trying to do the right thing?
Well, big question. So
Well, these are big ambitions that you've laid out.
I don't have a specific vision of a utopia. And actually, the thesis I mentioned that I wrote about utopia was exactly to that point, that there is no, utopia it comes from the words the good place and no place. And so I was arguing it doesn't exist physically, but that doesn't mean it's not an important impulse. For me, it's very dangerous to have a set idea of what is utopic. But what I do think is important is to realize our power and agency in creating the future and being a kind of active part of creating the present and the future, rather than just kind of sleepwalking into a future that we assume is going to happen because that's what the other forces in the world are creating. And so, in a way,
do you feel that's what people do in general? I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for that. The people don't feel that they can change anything around them.
I do feel that. Yeah, I don't like to make assumptions on behalf of other people because obviously you have a mix of. I'm sure it's a really mixed bag. But I think that quite often, going back to the vegetarian thing, when I was first turned vegetarian, I remember quite a few times people saying to me, "Yeah, but you don't eat this burger. I'm going to eat it." You're trying to make the point that it was completely meaningless, that choice. And so I'd always just be like, "Yeah, but if every single vegetarian tomorrow, kind of agreed with you, we would actually have an impact at scale." And I've kind of followed that thinking my whole life, that every individual contributes to the world we're creating, and it's really important for everybody, regardless of what position you're in economically and socially and racially, etc., to realize and recognize their own agency and their own impact in the choices they're making in creating our future.
What makes you sure though that one person's actions does make a difference?
Because we're all just one person, right? The world is composed of individuals. And
but you're a environmentalist, follower of Caroline Lucas, aren't you? I mean, obviously, in the climate change argument, the Green Party, for a long time before anybody else got involved in it, had been arguing. There was the classic argument around fossil fuels in Britain, with people saying, "Well, what's the point of Britain killing itself economically over fossil fuels when China's opening a new coal-fired power station every week?" How can you look at that and go, well, it does make a difference what we do?
Because that's such a fatalistic way to think. If we were to go, yeah, well, China's... Can I swear on this podcast? No.
Yeah, you can.
About to. Well, China's fucking over the planet, so we may as well, we should race them to the bottom. Okay, if you're
But that's not what people say, is it? It's that people say, what's the point of me spending more money and suffering when they are just screwing everything up?
Because all you can really change is yourself, right? I mean, you can try and persuade other people, you can try and have an impact through your work or through your voting or et cetera, but all you really can change is yourself, and I feel like that's the most important thing. And if nobody believes in their own power to change themselves and therefore the world, then nothing's going to change, for sure. But I'm saying that everyone does have that power, and actually if everybody exercised that power and thought kind of much more proactively about what is the future I want, what is the future I want for my children, what is the future I want for my grandchildren, if I don't have children, what's the future or what's the present that I want, in the next 30 years, I have 50 years that I want, then we would see changes happen, and I think that we'd have much more kind of engagement in the process of creating the future that we want, as opposed to just assuming that the giant multinational corporations are going to decide that for us, or the politicians are going to decide that for us, and we can be angry if they're doing it the way we don't like.
Do you feel that party politics is at all part of this? I mean, and a part of your life in terms of changing things?
In what sense?
Well, do you feel that your vote, for example, makes a difference?
I feel like it's really important to vote in the current kind of structures that we have, but I feel like it's very limited. I mean, we get to vote once every 5 years, really for 2 candidates in reality that are going to actually be in a position of power. And then even if the one you voted for gets into a position of power, you have no effect on the decisions they might make over the next 5 years, really. I'm much more interested in direct democracy, countries like Switzerland that have regular referendums. I think that's a much healthier way of operating democracy, because you're engaging people on much more granular issues, and getting feedback on more granular issues. And interestingly, I think there was a referendum, I was told anyway, in Switzerland, where they asked if people wanted to pay more tax, and the referendum people voted no. And I think it may also create a healthier culture towards tax, because if you have a choice over how your tax money is being spent, you might be much more willing to spend it.
So, and do you draw a distinction between regular referendums and occasional referendums, like the Brexit one?
Yeah, because
do you think the Brexit referendum was a good exercise politically or a bad one?
Well, I think the problem, I said to a friend, I've been thinking about direct democracy and interested in direct democracy for a long time, and there's quite a few interesting experiments happening around the world in that space. And I said it to a friend just after the Brexit referendum was having this conversation. He was like, oh, no, the last thing we needed is another referendum. And I was like, well, actually, I feel like we need more, and then our country would be a bit more kind of calm and sane when given that power to exercise a vote. I think maybe the reason why it became so hysterical, that specific referendum, was because it's such a rare opportunity for us to be able to exercise that power.
You mentioned, one of your ideas in Impossible, and where it started, was this idea of sharing. And by sharing, I don't mean the sharing economy of Uber and all the rest of it. I mean, this was actual sharing, wasn't it? People doing things without asking for money.
Yeah.
Did it fail as an idea, or has it worked?
It's a good question. I mean, it still exists. It's actually
just explain how it works, how it worked.
So, we built a social network kind of tech platform that let people create profile, like any other tech social media platform, create profiles and post things that they wanted help with or things they could do. And then we had a matching algorithm which would connect people to see how they could help each other. So I might see posts in London, for example, because I live in London, from friends of friends, connected to my interests and my skills, and vice versa. And the idea was that once you expose those points of kind of coincidence or connection, that people would help each other. I think it worked in the sense that we saw people actually doing favors for each other for no reason other than just it was a nice thing to do and they could. And I have lots of kind of sweet stories of friendships that were made or relationships that were made or kind of acts of kindness that happened through the platform. After running it for a few years, it was really hard to justify financially because I was basically
just losing money on it.
Yeah, and it hasn't really got a clear business model. At that point, it was just becoming quite a stressful exercise. So what we did is we open sourced the technology so that anyone else can use it, and now it's been adopted by a few different communities. There's a creative organisation in London called Creative Mornings who use it for their app to get more engagement through their community. There's also a refugee organisation who've just started using it to connect volunteers with refugee causes. And I think, depending on the success of that, I think it could have a very interesting afterlife in the kind of volunteer space, because obviously it's a natural fit for that type of tool. In terms of whether it failed as an idea, I still really believe in the underlying ethos, which is that give people the opportunity, and actually most people are kind and most people will help each other out, and there's something really valuable and healthy about creating that kind of community and culture. I don't know that tech is the right way to try and attack that problem in the way that I was trying to 5 years ago, because it's an expensive and difficult thing to manage and do well. But also, if I look at my own life, my own experiences, there are so many opportunities to help other people and kind of do favors that don't need to rely on tech, that can rely on just doing it. Yeah, just like talking to your neighbor, or speaking to friends, or there's so many other avenues to explore that idea that linchpinning it into tech is not necessarily the only or the best way to do it.
And also, I suppose that the dominant trend, if you like, for how technology has been used has been to squeeze the value out of our lives. It's to rent out a room, rent out our houses, rent out our cars, all those sorts of things, and try and make money rather than give things away.
Well, it was interesting because when we first started working on it, it was 2010, 2011 when I first started, and I went online and started looking up collaborative consumption, found Airbnb, which no one had heard of or very few people had heard of at that point in time, and a lot of these kind of early stage companies in what's now called the sharing economy. And it's been really interesting in that journey. Yeah, that's a whole different question. Yeah, but it was interesting watching that whole space explode in the way that I kind of anticipated it might. And then for everything to be grouped together onto that term, the sharing economy, I wrote an article with one of the co-founders of a kind of real sharing platform called Yodel on this, which is basically saying that you should distinguish between a rental economy, which has its benefits. It's not saying it's a negative thing, but is a rental economy versus what is a sharing economy, because sharing doesn't really make sense if it's a monetized transaction.
So where did that leave you, that experience, sort of in terms of your next idea or the next thing that you're interested in?
Well, I think I've kind of gone full circle in my relationship with tech. Not full circle, like probably 270 degrees. I started that project and I was such a tech utopian. I kind of dove really deep into the tech world and met tons of really interesting people working in the tech scene, and had this kind of amazing enthusiasm of, wow, tech can solve all our problems. And I still have a little bit of that current, and that's part of a lot of the other projects that we do at Impossible and the things I'm interested in. There's kind of a whole, I guess, collective of people who believe that tech will solve our problems, and some of our biggest problems, from like how do we remove carbon from the atmosphere to mining asteroids. But there's that school of thought, and I kind of entertain that, and I'm really curious to see where those ideas go, and maybe we'll be involved in different ideas in that space. And I have an increasingly kind of vocal voice though inside of myself, which is just questioning whether we'll solve the problems we've created through the same device. Like we're using really complex solutions to a complex problem, rather than thinking about stepping back from the problem itself, if that makes sense.
Give me an example.
So, for example, I interviewed Mark Boyle recently, who became somewhat kind of well-known, I guess, because he lived without money for 3 years. And that's how I met him when I was developing Impossible. I knew of his work in that space, and so we connected and became friends. He's now living in Ireland and has chosen to live without technology. And by technology, he's not living with anything like more complex than what he could build himself, is what he says. So no fridges, no freezers, no phones, obviously, no laptops. And he's doing that partially for social reasons, that he thinks he's actually having a more kind of valuable life experience in his relationship to other people and nature by not being on modern tech, but mainly for environmental reasons, because he argues that he's quite a campaigner, and he felt like he was being hypocritical campaigning about fossil fuel, for example, off a laptop, which couldn't exist without fossil fuel industries at this moment in time. And his point is, it doesn't matter whether you use your phone once a day or 50 times a day. To have it, we have to have mines, and we have to have international armies to negotiate contracts, and we have to have quarries, and it goes through kind of a long list of all the infrastructure that tech demands. And his argument has really been getting to me, actually. And I've been
about living a simple life.
Yeah, that maybe actually the answer is about simplicity, as opposed to what's happening, I think, right now. And I'm not passing a judgment on this one way or the other, but I say that if you look at the kind of investments that are being made into companies and government policies too, towards solving our major problems, and particularly the environmental problem, a lot of that is designing really complex solutions that will solve our complex problems, so that we can continue having...
So we can continue to live as we
live.
Yes.
Exactly. So we can not for a second question how we're living, and instead just find new ways of adapting the world so that we can continue our lifestyles, as opposed to going, maybe our lifestyles are the problem, and a much simpler solution might be to rethink our lifestyles.
Do you worry, though, that you may have that perspective from a position of privilege?
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
And that when you've got everything, it's easier to think about what don't you need rather than when you're striving to get the basics. Being told, forget about buying that car because it's bad for the environment is a different thing to what you're
yes and no. I think that if you are like literally trying to feed your family and below the poverty line, then for sure this is a position of privilege where you have the time to think the problem. And I said that at the very beginning of the conversation, right, that I feel like I'm privileged to, you have to come from a position of privilege to even want to try and change things, because you have to have the time and the space to be able to even reflect on what you want to change. So yes, I do see that. But I don't think it's enormous privilege. I don't have, I'm not as wealthy as many people think I am. It's not like I don't also have to pay a mortgage and think about looking after my family. And, I have normal, kind of, quote unquote, normal concerns too. So I don't think it's especially privileged. And actually, many of my most kind of proactive friends who would think about questioning their lifestyles are the ones who don't have very much materially.
I suppose, if you go to India and start talking about the environment, there's a big environmental movement in India, obviously, but if you go there and talk to people who, have grown up in really difficult lives, very poor, have got jobs in the new economy there, and are just getting up to sort of, the kinds of mod cons that we've all taken for granted in the West forever, whether it's a scooter or a car or a computer at home or a mobile phone or a flat with air conditioning. And suddenly they're being told, no, you can't have any of that because it's bad for the environment. And they're saying, hang on a minute, you've had this for decades and we're just getting there.
No, I know that's quite a common argument in especially these conversations where we try and, me personally, but politically, trying to get the developed world to not go down the same fossil fuel path. And they're like, yeah, but you guys have been doing this for 150, 200 years, our turn. I totally get the ethic dynamics of that. At the same time, we're all in a sinking ship, right? And if you look at the data for what the world's going to look like in 50 years, 100 years' time, if we don't think about ways of changing things, which could be inventing the complex solutions so we can continue burning fossil fuel and then in the meantime extract the carbon out of the atmosphere. Or it could be maybe through simpler ways. I'm not saying I have the answers. I'm saying those are the kind of thought processes I've been thinking
Have you tried giving anything up, or have you tried simplifying your life at all?
Yeah, I have. What could I give an example? I think I've simplified my life massively. I've more or less stopped buying stuff. Not buying stuff. Obviously I buy food, I'm not starving myself. But clothes and extra stuff. I'm really quite diligent about very rarely buying new things, and if I do, it's because I really love it and I'm going to wear it for the next 20 years or whatever. I've given up. Last year I gave up, which is not, I can't believe it took me this long really, single-use plastic water bottles. I've made a couple of exceptions when I've been on planes in the last year. And even those times I've tried to avoid it. I've tried to fill in the airport or something.
So you carry a bottle around with you? Or?
I did carry a bottle around with me everywhere until about 2 weeks ago when my bottle leaked and broke my laptop. So now I'm not, but I'm still not buying any plastic water bottles. And I want the next step to try and move away from plastic altogether. But that's really, and I've been trying to do that incrementally, using food delivery services that have less plastic than buying them from the supermarkets have loads of plastic. But I'm finding that that's a much more complex challenge.
What's the next thing you're going to do then? Do you have a thing of sort of an aim of sort of...
I think the tech is the next one that I'm really, I want to change my relationship to, and I've started thinking about changing my relationship to. So these don't have any environmental impact yet, but just in terms of measuring my own relationship to it, I've, for example, deleted the mail app on my phone and deleted the social media from my phone and just tried to change my relationship so I'm checking in much less.
The email app, do you mean, or the Daily Mail app?
The email app.
The email app.
I've never had the Daily Mail app on my phone. Thanks for checking. No, I mean the email app because I was emailing all the time. I've been trying to just moderate my own addiction to tech, and I would like to, as a next step, also think about whether to just get off a smartphone altogether. So that's, I think, probably the next place that I've
Is that hard
already...
with a child? I mean, do you know, are you thinking about how you're going to bring up, I don't know, is it a son or a daughter?
Daughter.
A daughter, you know, without her being stuck on an iPad or a phone or...
So it's an interesting challenge. It's a really big challenge. I asked that to Mark Boyle if he had children. He hasn't got children, but I said, if you had children, would you let them on tech? And he was like, I wouldn't let them anywhere near tech. And it has been a really big challenge for us because you can, you know, I'm 30. I didn't grow up with tech around, and I still recognise how addictive it is. So I'm slightly worried about a child who grows up with this addictive thing in her life, and I can see how addictive it is. I mean, I don't know if you have kids.
Yeah. They are addicted, yeah.
Yeah. How old are they?
12 and 10.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know they've always been allowed to use...
Yeah, but we ration it. I mean, we have a hotel combination safe at home, and all the devices go
really?
into the safe so that they can't.
Do you?
Yeah, because my wife used to hide the iPads and phones and lose them. And so I was given an iPad by my dad for my 40th birthday, and we lost it for a year and a half because my wife hid it and we couldn't find out where it was. So now we have a safe. But I mean, it's very, very hard to manage, especially with children that age, because they are independent. They're carrying their own devices around. My
I'm
daughter's
sure.
at secondary school, she's got a phone, you know, so it's kind of wrestling the phone off them that's enough of that now, it goes away, is every parent's nightmare in the Western developed world.
Yeah. Although it's a weird thing is like I had to work this morning and I sent my daughter to nursery. A friend of mine dropped her off. And it was an awkward situation. I didn't have time to drop her off like I wanted to. So my friend came to help do it. And she doesn't know him that well. And she was overtired. And I was like, you know what's going to solve this problem? Can you go to YouTube and go to Peppa Pig? And she'll be really happy for the next. Yeah. And it's moments like that where it's like you're giving your kid crack and it's solving a problem. But it's slightly scary, the effect that it is almost like a drug, the effect that it can that it could elicit.
But your aim is to get simpler as time goes on.
My aim has been to get simpler in every regard. So I've kind of done that with my fashion. I've done that with my food. Done that with the plastic, kind of starting with the plastic. And now I'm only very recently thinking about tech and what is my relationship to tech and am I addicted? And are there devices I can get that will last much longer than the devices I currently have been using? So that's the space I'm in right now.
In amongst all of this, I mean, you from time to time appear on television programmes. You've been on Channel 4 News about different issues like literacy and all those sorts of things. You're involved with lots of issues, I guess, because charities have approached you over the years and asked you to front things up for them. You get a lot of stick for it as well, don't you? I mean, you know, the Daily Mail will have a go at you and say, oh, you know, Lily Cole, she's got an opinion about everything. I mean, does that bother you?
I haven't ever read them write that, so I don't. So no, that hasn't bothered me. Because
you don't worry about what people think, you know.
I try not to. I mean, of course I do, because we're all human, right? It's like very hard to not be affected by other people's thoughts and opinions. And I've never read the Daily Mail write that, so I don't know what you're exactly referring to. But I do get worried that I will myself. I don't like being preachy, you know. So I do worry sometimes to not be preachy. But then sometimes it's like you're just talking about things you care about. You know, and
if you care about things and you want to change things, you have to preach a bit, don't you?
Well, you just have to talk, right? And it's not like I'm saying I'm right. I'm just like, I feel like we live in a society where people...
you are saying you're right, aren't you? I mean, that's the point of saying what you believe.
Well, everyone thinks they're right.
There's nothing wrong with believing you're right. That's why you're saying it.
I'm always open to being wrong. I really am. But I think that part of living in a healthy society is the ability to share opinions and the ability to share information. And I'm sharing my kind of thought process as I meander my way through life. It doesn't mean that I'm right, actually. I mean, there are some things I'll feel more strongly about maybe than others, but I feel like I'm as entitled as anyone else to share my thoughts and listen to other people's too, if that makes sense.
And is that what I mean? You put writer on as one of the things you are now in your own biog, don't you? I mean, you're writing a book at the moment.
Yeah, at this moment in time, it's funny when I go through airports because they always ask you to write your job, right? And you just put it in one word, and it's always different. It'd be quite funny to go through mine over the last 15 years, and I usually just write the one that I'm doing at that present moment in time because that always feels like the most appropriate. And right now, I've spent most of this year writing, so.
So you say writer.
So I don't know, but maybe if I was going through the airport, yeah, I would, because that's actually what I've been doing for most of the last.
And what's this book about? The one you're on at the moment.
So I've been working on two different things this year from a writing perspective. One is a short film that I've been working on the script for, and the other is a non-fiction book that I've been working on since last year, which is kind of an amalgamation of my experiences through sustainable fashion, through Impossible and the kind of tech side, and kind of looking at trends that you can identify through data that are happening, which are trying to fix the kind of negative environmental curve that we're on, as a way to kind of celebrate those and to hopefully inspire people to get on board with different ideas. And I'm presenting actually potentially quite contradictory ideas. So the conversation we just had around tech as a force for good or bad, I'm trying to explore both sides of that coin. So, the people who really believe that tech will save the world and are devoting their lives to trying to solve major problems through tech, and then people like Mark Boyle and also Aboriginal communities, and examples that are almost on the other side of the coin, where there are much maybe more simple ways to go about fixing these problems.
Well, I hope you'll come back and talk about that when it's
Sure.
done again. But it's obviously sort of what we've been discussing over the last few minutes as well. One of the questions I'm asking all the people who come here is, what's the most controversial thing you believe?
Oh, that's a good question. What have you had so far? What's the most? Can I spin it on you first, and then I'll answer?
No, I'm never allowed to say what I believe. I have to
really?
stay. Yeah, I have to pretend I have no opinions at all, because I do the news.
I guess two answers come to mind. One is and this isn't necessarily a belief system, but something I try and keep in mind, that I feel like I was taught a really specific idea of science in school, and about how the universe works and how nature works. I don't mean how everything works, how reality works, and that actually, like, it was only through my own research many years later that I started kind of tripping into quantum physics. And literally it's over 100 years that we've been dispelling through quantum physics a lot of the kind of Newtonian ideas that were handed down, and yet that isn't the version of science I was taught. And so I guess it's not controversial, but I feel like there's an assumption that we understand how reality works, and actually that reality may work in completely surprising and more magical and different ways.
Give me an example of the kinds of things.
Well, I'm not an expert, so I'm kind of dangerously going to go into territory where any quantum physicist listening will be outraged. But like, they've done experiments, for example, where if you do something to one electron, it affects a different electron in a different place. They've done other experiments where they think that you can have an electron in two places simultaneously, and it's not until it's observed that it will collapse in one or other. There's multiple kind of famous experiments like that confuse scientists, or have confused scientists, because they go against what we've been taught before. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if you ask people in the 17th century how the universe worked, you'd have a very different picture to what we have now, and they probably would have believed it was correct, and they would have built their philosophical, cultural systems around that understanding. And my point is that in 500 years' time, we might have a completely different idea. And the reality is that we don't know, and actually we may be quite arrogant as a species in assuming at this moment in time that we have a full understanding when we don't. And that's really exciting to me, that life is so much more mysterious than any of us necessarily know.
Lily Cole, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Cool. Thank you.
It's really nice to meet you.